2012 OSEP Project Directors Conference, Wednesday, July 25th, 2012, Marriott Wardman Park, Washington, D.C. Cultivating productive partnerships with educators at the local level. How do you get your foot in the door at the local level? What about if you are new to the area? Two women and a man sitting at a table in front of a class.
As Pat indicated, one of my background interests is behavior analysis, and I do a lot of functional behavioral assessments, and we were talking about that before we started. And I would suggest that one of the things you want to think about as a researcher, from my end of it, going and looking at trying to build partnerships with LEAs to do research and so forth, you might want to start out by doing a functional behavioral assessment of that relationship. And one of the things we noticed in my research group is that the incentives, the reasons why we want to do research are different than what LEAs want to get out of research. I want a publication, I want research sites, I want people to do what I say, I want. Whereas the LEAs want solutions for problems that are happening on a day-to-day basis. They want materials, they want consultation, they want freedom from some kids, they want, right? And what you notice about that analysis is that there are differences between what I want and what the LEAs want with respect to partnerships around research. So to getting your foot in the door, I believe, one of the things you want to do is with whatever level you're looking at, school, district, what have you, do that assessment and ask, what are they hoping to get out of a partnership in a researcher to LEA relationship? And look for those overlaps as a way to initiate the interaction around a research project or an activity. So do that analysis, because what you're going to find is different kinds of motivation for participating in partnerships between LEAs and researchers like myself. So the second part then is, one thing we've done at Connecticut, and we used to do at Oregon when I was there, is that we made sure as researchers that we made ourselves available to do consulting, or made ourselves available to help out or to provide materials without any connection to research, data collection, human subjects, all the things that go along with the research side. Because once you make yourself available and you can, and the LEAs recognize that you become a resource to them, when the request is made, well, we'd really like to study this a little bit more systematically around that question you had around working with that kid, one kid, Julia, or what have you. And then you have that opportunity to go a little further with the request. So 2 points. One is understand the context in which you're making the request. Second of all, or the door that you're trying to open, using Pat's question. The second of all, stick your nose in that door a little bit, but don't ask for anything until you've spent a little time there.
And I'm going to build on that, in particular focusing on the what do you do when you move somewhere that is different for your first academic job than where you've been trained or where you have experience. My PhD was completed in Illinois, Northwestern University. My public school teaching for 7.5 years was in Colorado, and my first job was in California. And one of the first research projects I did, I got a small grant my first year, was very excited, a research grant on campus. And it was basically a replication study of my dissertation work, which was on research on writing and self-efficacy. And didn't involve a lot of time from students or teachers, but I had a very hard time getting participants. And a few things I learned end of the following year, when I did actually a rather large-scale study, collaborating with Kathleen Lane and Eric Carter and Melinda Pearson, where we got into 10 districts, where before I couldn't get into one school. And a few things sort of had changed in those 2 years. The first was I made a conscientious effort to understand the language. All 3 states I'd been in used different things to describe kids, to describe their schools, to describe their programs, to describe their partnerships. And so I was able to, obviously at that point, have a better understanding. The other piece about California, which it took me a while to fully understand, was that we have a variety of different districts. We have a joint school district. We have high school districts. We have K-6. We have K-8. We have K-12. We have high school only. And as I drive to work on a 15-minute drive, I cross through all of those. And so I had to understand the context of the schools in which I also wanted to work. The next piece was that we had to, when we went to the larger scale project, we had to really understand that we worked with so many different districts. I have a district that has 6 schools. I have one that has 5. I have one that has 30. And so the variability was great in what their expectations were. So at one school, to start a research partnership, I needed to go through the school board first to be approved with a very formal written process. Another district, if a principal was willing, then I could take that willingness to the district for approval. Other places I didn't need district approval, I needed site-based. So to really understand the folks with whom you work is super important. I will tell you though, what I know was part of the development of partnerships is really a lot of what George just talked about. It's building relationships. I had the opportunity, I'll say, as part of my teaching load to do some supervision in the schools. And I gladly volunteered to have that be one of my courses because I knew it got me in to the school sites to really see how the work in California was being done. It also built relationships. So I was able to be there in a different role and to make a commitment to that school. They knew how I worked, they knew what support I could provide, and I will tell you, to this day, those principals continue to be super responsive. And when I call, when I email, they call back, they answer the phone, you know, I get in touch with them rather quickly, whereas that very first time I was calling, leaving messages at the front office, sending emails, and they didn't know, they knew a relationship with our university, but didn't know what role I played. So I think really it's understanding context, building partnerships, and a lot of that really is sort of part of that functional behavior assessment that you might do in the world in which you're now going to work. So it does take time, I guess is the real advice I have. Building relationships takes time. Understanding what those schools need and what you can give takes time in developing your projects. And I think I was all excited. I thought that first year I have this grant, I'm going to get this done, and I didn't. But that didn't mean I couldn't do more work in the future. And I've continued to do that, and even the schools that I'm not in directly, I still do have some contact with. I send them resources when I find them, things that I think they might find useful. So relationships do matter, and I think that's an important piece of it, is understanding who you're working with and what their needs might be.
I think those are excellent suggestions, both from George and from Kristen. I would add to that is that start to search out in the districts where you want to, where you are wanting to work. Where are the job alikes happening? Where are the principals getting together? If that particular state or district has a regional educational service agency, oftentimes they cross multiple districts. And those individuals and professionals in those agencies actually know a lot about the administrators, the schools, and the teachers. They know who might be working and would welcome help, who is a new administrator who would like to co-collaborate, and to have put a stamp on their school. So I would offer that you look into those. Oftentimes, large school districts have principal meetings. Ask to be a part of those. Ask to maybe if the principal meetings are not the vehicle, maybe the assistant principals. Oftentimes, they're looking to move up. They're welcoming an opportunity to work with someone, and they'll give you a lot of information about what's actually going on in the schools.
What attracts local service providers to new partnerships?
Good question again. Two things. One is, one thing we've noticed about attracting people to engage in the research that we do is that we start off by acknowledging where people are coming from initially. Two things about that. One is we've tried to make sure that we send out materials to local school districts and what have you that identifies things that they are concerned about themselves. If we communicate to them that we recognize the challenges they're having, much like what was described earlier, that we understand the kind of needs that they have, they're more likely to respond when we have something to initiate. I want to focus on the second item and spend more time on it, and that is, and I'm going to kind of brag a little bit, but at the University of Connecticut, when I first moved there 5-6 years ago now, we started something called a research collaborative, and it meets twice a year. My center that I run has 7 or 8 research participants in it, and what we do is twice a year we invite superintendents and principals to come to UConn, and what we ask them to do is to come with their research hat on. And at first, when we first did that, we thought, nobody's going to come. Why do they care about research? What happened is that we had 45 people show up at the superintendent, principal, and teacher level who came in wanting to know about how they could participate in research. So we asked them, why did you come? And they came because they said, you know what, it's the first time we've been asked to be an equal partner in a discussion around our needs for research, because we asked them to come with questions that they had. We did share with them our resources and things that we could do, but we did it in the context of responding to what their challenges and needs were. That research collaborative meets twice a year. We give them coffee, tea, and donuts. They're very happy about participating. We actually set ground rules that said we're not going to talk about cases, what do I do with kid who does what? We're actually going to talk about research questions around that problem. And they really appreciated the fact that we weren't going to give them answers, but instead help them generate ways to study the problem. So the big message there, I think, is one of the misconceptions, I think, is that we assume that school LEA types are going to be a little bit standoffish when you use the R word, research. But in fact, that if you treat them as professionals and respectful and acknowledge the knowledge they come with us to the conversation, they're actually more willing to participate. So I think that's an important part about getting started with forming new partnerships, is starting out with acknowledging who they are as professionals. The last thing I want to add, and it kind of goes back to what we talked about before about how do we get our foot in the door. I think it's really important to acknowledge what other research is going on in the field, in LEAs in particular. For example, at the University of Oregon when I was there, I would go out and ask a school to participate in a study. It turns out that that school was a control site for another researcher. And I'm asking them to do research for me and be the intervention treatment school. So they're in this challenge of managing multiple requests from researchers. So I think one thing as researchers we want to be sensitive to is what else is going on inside that school. Now, just to give you the juxtapose the difference, and I'll stop, is at UConn when I went there, and I see there's one Connecticut person in the room, so I'll be careful about what I say. Michelle's in the room, but she'll understand perfectly. When I went to UConn, it turns out there was not a lot of applied research going on in the schools, and they were very hungry for it. So when I walked out and said, here's some opportunities, at first I thought they were going to say, well, we're just too busy. Well, the opposite happened. They said, oh, this is great. We've never been actually asked to participate in behavior-based research. So I think you really do have to assess what's going on out there as a way to understand what the possibilities are for new partnerships, because we sometimes overuse our schools. And I look at Marshall in the back, and he knows Eugene, and just about every school in Eugene, Oregon is actively involved in some kind of research project at the University of Oregon, because there's so much research going on, and we overwhelm the field, and there's no new partnerships that are possible because of that kind of satiation.
One thing that we have made a commitment to do with our local school partners is that whenever they participate in research, we make sure that we send them any results once published as a courtesy. So we send articles or the links for those articles. Obviously, we tell them it may be a while before you actually see it in a different form, but as an acknowledgement with a thank you. So we literally do a personal thank you, send either via email or handwritten, and send them the work in which they took part in, their school, their teachers, their students, their programs. And so I think that is just a nice, simple way to acknowledge their participation. One challenge we have faced is we have some districts that do principal rotations, is what they call them. And so we may have set up some collaboration work and some research work to begin at a certain time. And every few years, they move around administrators in all the buildings. And so we have sometimes been faced with having something set up to some level, and suddenly there's this administration shift, and we might need that site for some particular characteristics. And then we have to make sure we acknowledge that as part of what their school culture is. And sometimes we don't necessarily get that work done at that time. That doesn't mean that the principal's not interested. We follow up with the principal who's moved, we follow up with the new principal, but we then have to acknowledge that that new principal coming into a new school may not want to participate at that time. And I think that's a very important piece, is that sometimes there are some things that happen beyond our control, and we need to acknowledge that they're not ready for it. We always make that connection. The other piece when we do send information about publications that have come from the work is we And part of thanking them for their participation is asking if they'd be willing to participate in whatever is coming next, and making sure we continue that connection. I have a wealth of number of buildings around our campus and within a relatively short drive, but that doesn't mean we don't spend more time in those ones that are closer. And that's important to consider, that we really want to make sure we're meeting their needs as well as obviously meeting ours for the research perspective.
One of the big things that we've done in our region in the northeast corner of Georgia is that we've had, very much like George had, a consortium, but we also invite the potential researchers in. And we met with each one of those groups separately to try to figure out if we could do a better job of helping them match their needs and match the research. And when we brought them afterwards, then we made the introductions. We offered those personal introductions and offered the opportunity for people to get to know each other, to build those relationships that Christian described that are so very important, because we are a community, and as we think about it, both in the LEAs and with the universities, we have a responsibility to each other to offer and to provide that opportunity so we build stronger relationships between our colleges and universities and our LEAs. And we really took that seriously, and we've done that a couple of times, and it's been very valuable. And that actually came from our colleges and university. They asked for it. So don't think that if it's not happening in your area that you might not reach out and figure out a way to do it. And it was so strong, it was continued in one of our larger school districts, because it helped the LEA monitor so many individual requests didn't go to one school, or didn't go, and we did it so many requests didn't go to one system, and that we had a chance to broaden that.
What timelines or scheduling considerations play a role in these partnerships?
So I have sort of three ideas for you to think about with respect to scheduling and timing, and it's sort of probably the general kind of things, and I'm sure they'll give more specifics. One thing we've learned about timing and scheduling is that when we go in and do research with or joint start partnerships with LEAs around research, is we make it very clear that if there's data collection or activities that go beyond the scope of your regular work, teacher, we do that as the researcher. If it's part of the work or expectations for the research that is part of your job already, then we'll help you and collect that back and so forth. But our general rule is we try not to ask people to do stuff that's different, that's not the same as they would typically do as part of their jobs. Because what we find is, as researchers, we want to go and say, we want you to normally teach like you normally do so we can watch you, but we also want you to do these other 7 things to help us out. And that's where that problem and the rub comes in with being able to maintain future research. So the comment about what scheduling and timing is making sure that what we ask people to do fits into what's already ongoing, because if it requires major changes in the typical scheduling, then they get this rub and it becomes more aversive and more difficult to do. Second point I wanted to make is just to spend time ahead of time, and using the language that was described earlier about building these relationships with the people doing the research, the classroom teacher, the school psych, or whatever. You want to spend time before you actually begin the research so people are clear about what's expected, what's going to take, and you have that discussion around negotiating certain tasks, what have you. And the third thing, which I'll end with, which is fairly specific, what we like to do with schools ahead of time is say to them, before we start off with this research, let's do a little pilot. Let's do a little dry run of what this might look like to get a sense about what the effort is going to be, what it's going to feel like to participate. And then we get a sense about this is going to work or not, or do we have to change the design, or what have you. The mistake I've made in the past is say, here's my study, it's been approved by IRB, this is what my committee's approved, this is what my partners approve, this is what the feds want, do it for me. And it's not going to happen if we don't engage in this process of making sure people are clear about what it's about. And we've always said this is not going to be possible, let's check out of this, as opposed to trying to force or convince. So I think, do a pilot, spend a little time with the players, and thirdly, making sure that we think about being sensitive to the schedules and expectations that are already there. And if it is beyond the normal job description of the people in that setting, we do that. If it's something that is typical, then we ask them to help us collect that back. But otherwise, we have a really hard time doing applied research if it's not really something that's kind of natural and relevant to them.
I'll use an example, a personal example to the timeline issue. We were doing a large scale with a lot of participants on teacher expectations of behavior. And it was something extra, but it wasn't necessarily a complex assessment tool that they needed to respond to. But it did take time. It took administrator time to allow us in. It took time for the teachers to do the task. And we had, I think we were in 9 districts, I might have misspoken on the number, but 9 different school districts, multiple schools. So even though we had district permission, some principals said, not this month. Other principals said, testing's coming up, can we do it after the testing window? And we spent an entire year, really what was about 20 to 30 minutes at a school site of my actual time standing up in front of the staff and them doing the work. But it took us that long to schedule into multiple different settings. I had some principals that would call and say, or email and say, I know you're scheduled to come to our all-school staff meeting on Thursday, but something came up and we must change our agenda. I don't think I'll have time for you. Could you come this next time? Luckily, I had a partner, a collaborator on campus with me. And so she and I very often were trading and swapping school sites because of the fact that we needed to make sure we were acknowledging that it was time for them to do this task for us. And if it couldn't work this month, but it could work in 3 months, we needed to be able to do it. We originally had it scheduled in the fall, and it actually wasn't until the 3rd week of May that I actually had gotten to every school site. And that is something that I think we need to acknowledge. We have a timeline, but we also have to make sure we're respecting the school's needs and their timelines. We needed something from them, obviously, but I wasn't about to say, if it's not this week, we don't want to do it. Of course we said, absolutely, we understand what time would work best for you. Do you want us in is there an in-service day? What works for your schedule? And we found, with the exception of one site we never actually finished with, the principal just said, I just can't, if something had come up at the school, he said, we can't do it. And I said, that's fine. We thank you so much for your willingness. So that's that piece. We all have timelines. And sometimes we need to really, truly collaborate on those and realize that it might be a little longer than your original expectations and plan for that research study. And it did take us longer, but we felt very fortunate that we were able to get all these data that we did receive. It just took us almost another semester to actually get in and out of all the schools. So that is that piece of understanding the culture, understanding the context, and being sort of responsive to changes that come up that may not be things that you had scheduled in that original timeline plan, IRB approval, study design.
And I agree with Kristen. Those kind of things come up in schools all the time, but I've got some suggestions that I think might help you avoid some of those pitfalls. When you get with the principal or the administrator in the school, what I would ask you to do is ask them to pull out their school schedule and go through it month by month with them across your timeline, and build in a couple of extra months, because those things always happen in schools. As much as you plan, as much as you hope that things are going to go according to the schedule that you're proposing, schools are organic and fluid places, and things come from the top down or from the bottom up that they must deal with. And one of the things I want you to be aware of is that if you're looking at to provide an intervention or to have something happen, and that if it's going to impact a master schedule, those schedules, those administrators are working on those schedules the first week in February of the year prior to school opening. So if you think you're going to arrive in August or and have anything change, that is a major thing in a large high school. It probably isn't going to happen. So think always that master schedules are running in your life almost 6 months to 8 months ahead of time. The other thing you should be aware of, I work a lot in high schools and middle schools. You need to know if it's going to be Spirit Week. Mm-hmm. You need to know if that's the week of homecoming or the prom. Those are very real cultural things in schools, and school's not operating on a regular schedule during those large weeks. And so when you look at those month-by-month schedules with the administrators, and you're looking at that, you want to be aware, because that is such a part of a administrator's life, they may never think to tell you. So that would be my number one suggestion to avoid some of the pitfalls that happen there.
And I think many are publicly posted. We can pull down some of those schedules off school websites, and that's a great suggestion. That's one thing we did, was look at the district calendar and then a school calendar when we made the initial contact, and that's something really helpful. There's a lot of information. That's a great idea.
What incentives might be offered to encourage and maintain successful partnerships?
And one of the things I would ask you, very much what Kristen and George said earlier about the relationship, you need to really listen to why that school administrator or those teachers are participating. And if they are participating and they're wanting to maybe have some recognition, or to if they're considering moving up, a well-placed and well-written letter to their superintendent, if it's a small school system, to that might, or attend a board meeting, so they can do a presentation. Those small gestures on your part will go a long way in helping build those relationships for others who are going to come behind you, and for you if you're looking to work in those schools again. I would say things that really don't cost money, but provide a sort of celebration of an honoring of their participation in the work really help. Maybe if once the article or the publication comes out, helping to craft a newspaper article for their local newspaper. Just bringing that to the attention and asking, can we jot some things down? This would be, I'd be glad to work on that article with you. Go a long way in that relationship building and building partners for the future.
Incentives are a very challenging thing. Right? I mean, we know that in research, and we have to, I think, understand, it goes back to the initial response from George. We need to understand what it is that they need from their collaboration and work with us. I happen to be a part of a program that is large. We have about 140, 150 candidates, they're all post-baccalaureate, in student teaching placements every semester. So we have a great need there as well. But our principals also tell us, we want your candidates, because we do a lot of the preparation for the teachers in our region. We want your candidates because we know down the road they can be hires. And we have, not on a research standpoint, although there's research follow-up, we've been running some pilot projects on changing our teacher education program and how field work and student teaching works. And I will tell you that the principals that have been willing to participate in that have been very willing to try to think about something in a different way, which has been exciting for us. We made sure that when we did the small story about the partnership with the 325T grant and a new way to do our student teaching, we had a school site that had willingly taken, at junior high, willingly taken multiple student teachers in this new model, and we asked, could we do the story at your school site? And they gave us permission and access. So there's that mutual partnership. They are willing to help us. We are willing to help them, obviously. And I think the big thing goes back to what we can do to support them in the future. I was in a high school in that same district for 4 years, working with their staff and doing some dramatic change to how they delivered services and supports at the secondary level. And I'm no longer on site there, but I still, to this day, when I see information, a news link, something coming through, usually via email, I send it to that principal and say, hey, I think this might be of interest to you. And I think that is an incentive that you can't measure with dollars. That the resources that you know they may still need, you can keep sending after that partnership is over, because that is, I think, very important to maintaining those relationships, because there will be future partnerships, you hope.
So I have 3 or 4 quick little suggestions, and one is sort of a cheating thing, so be careful about this one. The question says about encouraging and maintaining. One thing to think about as a new doctoral student, new researcher, new higher ed person or what have you, as you approach an LEA and you're thinking about trying to establish a relationship, one thing to do is to cheat and tag team with another researcher. Because I always remember when I first started out, I'd go out in the field with a Mike Nelson or an Ed Blackhurst, or and they would already have an established relationship. So I could tag team along. Now that tag team doesn't mean you go in and take over, or you say, I want you to do more. It means taking advantage of what's already there, because it is a well-established relationship. You can get research started and so forth. So it is sort of cheating in one way, but there is a research community that you want to participate in and you want to take advantage of and encourage, because it will kind of get you started on the process. So the tag teaming, I think, is an important one. But you got to, again, be careful about how that goes about, because you want to make sure that you're not asking for more or intruding. Second thing I want to communicate, which actually is an elaboration of what Kristen and Laura already indicated, and that is the incentives or the feedback has to be given to a very broad audience, not only to the kids, teachers, but also to family members their kids have been participating in the research. We want to make sure that all people who have been affected by the activities are acknowledged for this. Yes, the teachers who helped out are important, but we have subjects, quote unquote, who are participants, and their families who have actively allowed their students or children to be part of the research. So I would expand out that incentive thing. Related to that incentive question, one thing that we do quite a bit of is including the LEA active participants in our publications and presentations. I'll always remember back in 1995, Rob Horner and I did one of our first PBIS studies in a school at Fernridge Middle School. If you look at that paper that was published in 1995, the first 5 authors are the members of the PBIS leadership team. So they were the first 5 authors on this 7-author strand, right? Not only did it make them feel good, it made the district acknowledge that we do evidence-based practice in our district. And here's evidence of the fact that we are evidence-based in our own activities as well. And that's particularly important now in 2012, when evidence-based is the adjective that goes in front of everything. So how do districts and teachers and others demonstrate that they're being evidence-based in their own efforts? So I'd include the people you're asking to participate in your research as active participants in the dissemination, in publications, presentations. Yes, 2 days ago you had 2 keynote presenters who were principals, who were actually presenting on behalf of consumers of the work that we do in Part D money. And the last thing I wanted to indicate to you is that sustaining research relationships is also about continuing your interactions after the research ends. And that continuation involves 2 things. One is helping people translate the research into actually applied practice. Because what I study as a researcher may not be something that real people can do in real life. So I have to translate how to do functional behavioral assessment based on the research I've done in a way that says, now, this is how you really might want to apply this in your environment. This is what it's going to look like in a kindergarten versus a middle school or what have you. We have to help that translation occur. Because if they don't see any applied utility of the research they engaged in, next time they're going to say why. So I think that's an important one. The other thing we do is we always show up afterwards. Now that may not be a good thing because they're tired of us, but you want to go in and say, how is it going? Is there anything else we can do for you as a result? Can we clean up the mess we caused or whatever? Because we want to make sure that they don't see us as coming in on December 1st and leaving on February 29th and never seeing us again. That relationship is one that's ongoing and not just about research. It's about improving outcomes for kids and improving the capacity of those people to use that research well. So the sustainability question is about making sure that there's this ongoing relationship and operationalizing it around, how does that look? So I'll stop there.
How do you determine or negotiate mutually satisfactory roles?
I think we've covered a lot around that question, but what I would add to that conversation is that be very honest and clear right up front. I know a lot of administrators initially, before we started that consortium, a lot of the administrators were so concerned because as they worked with students, things were needing to be tweaked as they went along a little bit, and the researchers did not understand that a tweak might take hours and hours or days of work on their part to allow things to happen in terms of scheduling and in terms of access to students or teachers. Just that those types of things, and being very honest and clear so that both of you understand what the expectations are. I know that a lot of administrators have misconceptions of what their role is going to be, and teachers have misconceptions of what their roles are going to be in this process. And especially if you build on, like George was saying, of going that sort of relay of moving in after someone else is finished, or partnering with someone, that if you'll have that conversation with them about what were their expectations, so that we can continue to build and to make clear and to shatter some of those misconceptions and misperceptions of administrator schools and in the LEAs.
I would say communication is key, and that other piece, any of the research on collaboration and collaborative partnerships has a message that no two partnerships may operate exactly the same way all the time. And having a good understanding of that is important. One principal might want a reminder coming through the front office where you email or call and leave a message. Another one might want it coming straight to them. Another might want their assistant principal to handle those kind of contacts. Another one, it might be someone in the guidance counseling office. And understanding what those roles are is really important to establishing sort of what that partnership is going to look like and how it's going to operate. Another, just an aside that I don't think I'd mentioned, is the follow-up that happens between making the timeline, that commitment and connection, to actually when it happens. Sometimes there's obviously a few months in between to keep that communication going between when you have established when a research project may start in a school, to check in because of those ebbs and flows that happen in school calendars. A reminder that you're coming next Thursday, is that still 10 o'clock, whatever it might be, and making sure you come at 10 o'clock if that's what has been established. All of those things are really important, I think, to maintaining that relationship, which is what it comes back to in partnership.
A couple things, I think, around sort of negotiation. One, I think, and I'm an applied researcher, and I tend to do relatively small kinds of studies, not small studies, but small sample studies, and I use a lot of single subject research. And because of that, I have the freedom or opportunity or luxury, if you will, being able to start off by saying, you know, what are the most important needs, challenges you have? So negotiation goes a lot easier if you are able to identify with what your site has identified as being a challenge. So that's been, I think, really important, that you acknowledge what it is that's most pressing. Is it a question? Is it a need? Is it an interest? As a way of trying to start the conversations about what research is possible. Now, having said that, I'm also participate in research that has large randomized control trials, where you say, well, we're going to randomly assign your school, your classroom to this, and we're going to do this to this group. And by the way, you know, what we're going to ask you to do is business as usual, and your partner down the hallway is going to be asked to do something else. So that's a really interesting negotiation, because, of course, they want to start with the intervention right away because they feel like it's going to be the answer to their challenge. So negotiations, to me, is about making sure people understand what the intervention is and what its benefits and pitfalls might be, so they understand that it's a test. The second part is, you know, developing designs or activities in which you always say, you're going to have access to the best aspects of this intervention as we go through the process of the research. So it's not that you're never going to get it, it's that we're going to test it out to make sure you get the best result, get the best intervention based on our results. It's always difficult to negotiate that. Well, you're in the control wait list. You're going to have to wait 5 years before you get it, and that's a hard negotiation to make, and it's really about understanding the nature or challenge of the problem you're trying to answer, as well as the knowns and unknowns about the intervention. Is this something that we really can trust? And so it's really a difficult process, and I think it's about making sure you're honest, as was said earlier, having open communications about what it is we're manipulating. It's about making sure we say, this is some of the costs that you're going to have to consider in a way to get access to some of the benefits. And that kind of comparison, that discussion is so important. Now, we're kind of painting it as, you got to really respond to the recipients, but on the other hand, it is a give and take. And as I mentioned before, our research collaborative is a great group because they understand if they engage in a conversation around research with us, quote unquote, that it is a shared discussion, but they're also going to have to tweak a little bit, just like we're going to have to tweak. And that discussion is a lot easier if you have an ongoing relationship, as was discussed earlier. As new doctoral students, you're stuck. Or new researchers, you're stuck because you have to go out and shake hands a lot and smile a lot. And then you can have those kinds of discussions. But when you get old like I am, you can depend upon that kind of status stuff to make it go. But it is a difficult challenge. It is about conversations and so forth.